Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Brogno. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled How to Make Clinical Trials Patient-Centric, an overview of TransCelerate's Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire Toolkit. Today is the second of two sessions today. Next slide, please. Again, my name is Anthony Brogno. I am the Program Manager here at TransCelerate, overseeing our patient initiatives. With me on the line today is Michael Vaughn and Amber Williams, providing project management support for our webinar today. Next slide, please. Our expert presenters on the line with us today is Lani Hashimoto. She will be presenting some of the details as we progress through the webinar. And Allison Green is not with us today. Next slide, please. Please note that all lines have been muted to ensure a pleasant listening experience for all attendees. You may reduce the GoToWebinar control panel by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We welcome questions throughout the discussion. Those can be submitted using the questions function you should see in your control panel. Be sure to select send after typing your question into the box. Next slide, please.
Oh, all right, you can say.
We'll be using the GoToWebinar polling function during today's webinar. Your participation is voluntary and all responses are anonymous. Aggregated answers are shown as a percentage of all respondents. To test out the system and to ensure our audio is working properly, we will launch our test question now. Okay, and with the majority of the votes in, we will close the polling. And it looks like everyone is comfortable with the polling feature. So thank you for participating in that. Next slide, please. So we'll go over some of the ground rules for today to really help make this conversation very fruitful and beneficial for all. Participation is voluntary, as is using any of TransCelerate's assets and tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned solely by the solution adopter. You don't have to identify what company you work for during this webinar. Some things that we would ask you not to discuss during the Q&A sections, it's what vendors, sites, CROs you are using or not using, any issues that you may have with any of the vendor sites or CROs, any of your company's long-term development plans, and anything related to costs. And we can't answer specific questions as they relate to vendors, costs of implementing any of TransCelerate's assets or tools, and which member companies are using the assets or tools. Next slide, please. This is just a high-level view of our agenda for today. We'll do a quick intro to TransCelerate and provide some background on our organization. We'll provide an overview of the Patient Experience Initiative. We'll then take a look at specifically the Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire, also known as the SPFQ, and then allow for some time for some question and answers. Next slide, please. So we'll go right into a TransCelerate overview, and we're going to kick it off with another poll question. If you could please just select which best applies to you, whether you're with a patient advocacy group, research center or hospital, a CRO or service provider, an industry sponsor, including a TransCelerate member company, or other not preferred to respond. Okay, we have about 60% of the votes in. I will close the polling in a moment. Okay, thank you all for voting and using this feature. And I think almost as we expected, we have a lot of industry sponsors here learning more about the Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire. Very happy to see that research centers and hospitals are also on the line to help learn more about the questionnaire and how it can be implemented and used throughout clinical trials. Next slide, please. So just a brief intro about TransCelerate. TransCelerate is a nonprofit organization really created around the idea of fostering collaboration among sponsor companies. Really, we share one vision. It's to improve the health of people around the world. really by accelerating and simplifying the R&D process to help develop new therapies. Next slide. TransCelerate was founded in 2012 with 10 member companies and only 5 initiatives. Today, we are at 20 member companies and have over 25 initiatives. And to help create our initiatives and assets in our initiatives, we work with many organizations, many health authorities, and many other groups such as patient advisory groups, site advocacy groups, and others to help make our assets a success. Next slide, please. TransCelerate has our initiatives bucketed into 3 different categories. First, you have our harmonization and process and sharing of information. Second, you'll see our enhanced sponsor efficiencies and drug safety, which is known as our pharmacovigilance portfolio. And then we have our improve the patient and site experience, and you'll see the list of initiatives that we have underneath this group. And specifically today, we are talking about our patient experience initiative and everything that we're doing underneath that initiative, and specifically talking more about that study participant feedback questionnaire. Next slide, please. So with that being said, I will gladly hand over to Lonnie, who will provide a brief intro about herself and then go into an overview of the patient experience initiative. Lonnie?
Thanks so much, Anthony. Hi, everybody. This is Lonnie Hashimoto, and I've been a proud member of this TransCelerate patient experience team for the last 2 years, though as you see, that team's been working for even longer than that. So even as we review the patient experience toolkits, the philosophy, and then we move on into the SPFQ, know that Allison and I are representing a much larger team, representing almost all of the member companies involved in the TransCelerate consortia, and tons of consultation with stakeholders within the member companies to get these materials prepared, and that always patient input has been a part of the development. So our patient experience efforts have always been done in lockstep with patients and patient advisors. So as we get started into the patient experience overview, could we have the next slide up, which is our next audience poll? And you'll see as we get into the slides maybe why we're asking this question right up front. Would you share with us your own experience? Are you currently collecting real-time feedback in your clinical trial design? And if so, at 1 point, multiple points after the study, let us know what your experience is so far.
Okay, we have about 55% of the votes in. We will keep the poll open for a few seconds longer. Okay, we'll get ready to close the poll now.
So mostly no on this group, and it's a little different from our earlier session today. This is the second of our 2 webinars. So thanks for sharing this with us. As we go on to the next slide, I think that this is true and was our assessment of the landscape of the industry as the patient experience workstream was developed and began to develop these toolkits. There we are. So the state of patient experience in clinical studies is that while I think far and away, and you can tell even from the interest in the number of participants in these webinars over the course of today, there is a great deal of interest and enthusiasm among our development organizations and our research centers for patient partnership and patient experience, but not a lot of tradition for how we do this. And so, actual implementation of patient engagement has been the hurdle in the last several years. So that challenge was taken up by our teams. In our own surveying, we have results similar really to what we are seeing together right now. 0 of 14 of our surveyed pharmaceutical sponsors had consistent company-wide processes for asking for feedback from clinical study participants. Only 1 in 14 received feedback from patients who had declined to participate in a clinical study. So while there is great interest, we've struggled with implementation, and hence the need for this TransCelerate patient experience work stream. If we move on to the next slide, please. So the vision then for this team is to build on that overall TransCelerate mission, and then to improve engagement and partnership between our pharmaceutical companies and patients in order to create better experiences. We'll say here for clinical study participants, caregivers, and families, but we should also say with. So we want, this team very much wanted to create something that is better, but also to create something with our participants. And the expectation is that as we develop better understanding with and from participants, caregivers, and families around study design, scientific objectives, even scheduled activities, that we can translate that directly into more diverse patient population support, reducing patient burden, increasing perception of value, and increasing patient empowerment, and hopefully even into additional willingness to participate and stay in our clinical trials. Maybe even tell a friend. Let's go on to the next slide. So that in mind, the patient experience workstream was launched in 2016 with a robust literature search and a significant number of patient interviews to learn where the priorities are, what domains should be included in some of our activities. And from that, the decision to focus our efforts in 2017 went to these bookend among a program, these bookend toolkits, the PPET and the SPFQ, and I promise I will say more about that in just a moment. Over the course, once those were chosen and the tools themselves began to be developed, in 2018 our focus turned to stakeholder feedback, a lot of testing, not just of the tools, but even more so of the toolkits and the user guides that will support the implementation of the toolkits. Because to say, yes, you should have a patient advisory board, or yes, you should ask participants questions was one thing. How to execute has been a much larger question, and we've spent a lot of last year finalizing those toolkits and then piloting and testing them late last year going into this year, so that those toolkits really became very tight, and we had the experience of piloting from a number of the member companies. As we bring ourselves to this point of this year, there's been some additional testing that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, but we'll also take this opportunity to celebrate where we are right now, and that's release of the toolkits for public use. I think we can go on to the next slide. So the patient experience then initiative over the course of these nearly 4 years has delivered now 2 toolkits. The first of those, some of you may have participated in the earlier webinar earlier this week, but the first of those is the PPET, or the Patient Protocol Engagement Toolkit. And that toolkit is built around the support of planning, developing, and executing patient advisory boards to seek feedback and insights into the clinical study design or operations, and helps sponsors, of course, engage with patients during that upfront design phase. The second of the toolkits then, thank you very much, is our SPFQ, and why we're here tonight to talk about the study participant feedback questionnaire. And this toolkit then supports both the socialization among any study sponsor to begin to adopt this tool, the very detailed operational user guide, and then the questionnaires themselves that are a 3-set questionnaire that could be used independently or together for the beginning, during, or middle of study, and then end of study questionnaires. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So with these two toolkits, I mentioned earlier, bookend the PPET, or Patient Protocol Engagement Toolkit. We envision in use early during design of studies, as early as target product profile, or even into protocol optimization, and perhaps even at multiple time periods through that process, as the questions and the refining of the questions that you might want to speak to patient advisors would adapt and develop during that time. Then the study participant feedback questionnaire is used to gather feedback during the clinical trial or during the protocol execution. So just a different way of looking at that across our study development milestones. We can go on to the next slide, please. In terms of realizing the value of these toolkits, they represent a number of opportunities to capture feedback and insights with these tools in study design and in execution, to collect feedback before, during, and after studies, to understand that patient experience, to diagnose with participant feedback things that could be improved about a study or its operations, and of course to gather patient feedback to engage and work with participants during the studies. And we expect that the value that we're going to reap from that, whether it's the PPET, the SPFQ, or even ideally both of those tools on any individual program, could help us to decrease patient burden in studies, to positively impact recruitment, adherence, compliance, retention, and to make, of course, the protocols more patient-centered, and ultimately to support our studies to be more efficient. So that is the patient experience overview, and let me hand it over then to Allison Green, who has been our SPFQ subteam lead and has led the development of the SPFQ toolkit. So, thanks, Allison.
Thank you, Lonnie. And as Lonnie said, my name is Allison Green, and I have been on this patient experience team with TransCelerate for the past 3 years, and did help co-lead the development of this particular toolkit we're going to talk about, the Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire, or SPFQ. But also behind the team have been many very dedicated, hardworking colleagues. So it's always a group effort. And good morning to everyone here. I think for most people it's morning, and thank you for joining us. So I am going to give you the overview, as I just said, of the SPFQ toolkit. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Great. So we're calling it a toolkit because even though the SPFQ is a set of questionnaires, it really works together and was developed with multiple parts to support, to support use. So it's a whole set of these tools to help anyone implement it and use it in their trials, and which consists of 3 pieces. There's a socialization presentation, which will help you and your organization talk about, why this would be beneficial to use and make a decision and get everyone familiar. The implementation user guide, which takes the study team through the details and all the things to consider about what it would take to implement it. And then, of course, the instruments themselves. And the SPFQ is a set of 3. 1 questionnaire is administered at the beginning of the study, 1 in the middle, and 1 at the end. And I will talk about all these a little more in detail in a few moments, but we'll go through them one by one. And then, as it says at the bottom of the slide there, you can go on to the TransCelerate website and be able to read more detail about it and actually download all the components. So next slide, please. Thank you. So a bit of history. One of the things that is very unique about the SPFQ toolkit is not only is it the whole set of tools, not just the questionnaires themselves, but we've taken a very careful and scientific methodology approach to developing them. So there are other experience questionnaires out there, but this particular questionnaire, set of questionnaires, that is meant to be used to measure the patient's experience while participating in the clinical trial, outside of protocol endpoints, was still developed following a modified best practices methodology. So we used psychometric methods. The FDA has a PRO guidance. The European Medical Association has their own guidances for best practices. So even though this toolkit doesn't measure trial experience, it measures patient experience, it's still well developed and has a lot of science behind it. So very briefly to describe it to you, on the left side, you see the funnel graphic. And in the first version, the typical methodology is that we did literature reviews and a lot of interviews with the sponsors who would be implementing it. We talked with patients and clinical trial sites. We held advisory boards to understand what using SPFQ would mean for them and what their concerns were. And then we did over 100 one-on-one patient interviews where we talked to them about, in open-ended questions, about what was important to them. These were all patients who had participated in randomized controlled trials within the past couple of years. So we were finding out what that experience was like so we could develop the first draft. That's on the left side. And then on the right side of it, of this graphic, we show what we spent. This says 2018, but we also in 2019 at the bottom there. But we spent the next 2 years taking all that information that we've gotten from patients and sites, advisors, patient advisors, and our own internal teams, and created a draft of the questionnaire. And we put it through standard PRO development methodology, where we tested our questions and the wording and the options to respond. And then we talked again with our sites and some CROs, contract research organizations, to understand if they were asked to use this by a sponsor, what would that mean? We did more interviews, more testing. We adapted the questions based on that feedback we got, and created the toolkit, which you see at the bottom of this graphic. And we already touched on what's in the toolkit, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But the one thing that is very, very unique about this particular questionnaire is that at the end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, we took the questionnaire, which had been developed originally in English in the UK and US, and we expanded it globally. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what's really unique and exciting about the toolkit and the questionnaires themselves is that we did these interviews with patients one-on-one in their own first language, with interviewers who spoke the first language. Globally around the world, you see 55% were representing the EU, but the US, Asia, South America, and we also got a broad range of therapeutic areas. We want this to be as relevant as possible to as many patients as possible across several therapeutic areas. And then one of the things that isn't on this graphic here is that we've got about half and half of men and women who participated. And then in terms of education, it's a very good mix of patients who participated in trials around the world, who ranged from primary education, high school, to university. And most of the people at least graduated from high school and had a little bit of some post-high school level. So we're confident that this questionnaire really represents people well across education spectrum. And then by race and ethnic background, it's a pretty good mix. It's of people who represent these various countries, and we can't give you more specifics on that because privacy laws around the world in various countries prevented or influenced how different patients chose to self-identify on some of these issues, but it's actually a quite good and very unique and diverse way of developing a questionnaire for patient input. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 key components that are included in the SPF Toolkit. The first one is the implementation user guide here. And what's unique about this is that we realized as we were talking about developing a questionnaire for patients that many times our companies and as sponsors, we have good intentions of trying something new to get more patient input or make trials a better experience, but we don't always provide the support to our clinical trial teams or our sites or the CRO partners on how they would be expected to use those materials. So we said we needed to spend as much time planning, the support information and user guide for our own internal teams and our partners as we did develop these questionnaires. So the implementation user guide is composed of a lot of information about sponsor planning, and it's generalizable enough that any sponsor or other medical research organization who wants to could use it easily. It doesn't tell you what to do. It's really a collection of things to consider. So the idea is, and in talking to our stakeholders who would be using this, we realized that if people are given some information ahead of time about all the different people that need to be consulted and functions and stakeholders who might have input, that it can anything can be successfully planned and implemented. So the user guide, which you'll be able to go and download and read it, is really about things for everyone to think about. So next slide, please. Great. So this is an example of some of the content that you would find in the user guide. One of it is around liaison considerations, and it's just one model. We had feedback from some early adopters and others who said that this approach works well, that a liaison is a partner, one person or team who's responsible to talk to the clinical teams or the study teams about any issues they have and challenges and helping them figure out how to implement. And it's things like, the liaison should be prepared to help a study team raise awareness to internal leadership, identify who on your executive board or your management board would be your champion to help, communicate that we want to support and use this in our organization. And the other thing that has been found to be helpful is to create a core team that includes the key people that operate, on any clinical study, and have those core team members, meet regularly and give advice, even if they're not working on a particular study. And then the other thing that they want to help do, that we suggest help do, is have the liaison, help roll out the SPFQ Toolkit. So this person or committee might go to various study teams or however it works in your organization to talk about, there's this SPFQ Toolkit, and we want to use it within our organization and let people know about it early so that when they do start planning a study, that they're already aware of it. And the person could also help provide training. And then also support is important. Once a study team, says, yes, we will take this on, even though this is a good toolkit, and we developed it hoping that, study team could use it to, help guide them through this process, that it's still important if there's someone in the organization, if they're able to meet regularly and answer those questions and share the lessons. And one example of what a cross-functional stakeholder might look like, where there's a template there that would have somebody thinking about using the SPFQ to sit down ahead of time and try and think through in your organization who would be the people to have in any of these roles. And this could differ based on, how you do things. So next slide, please. So this is one example of how the SPFQ might work. It actually probably is a real example that came from one of the early adopters. And in this scenario, we've got the researcher who is working on a clinical study for, a biopharmaceutical company. He isn't necessarily, a member of the company's study team, but he's been asked to do this work. And Bob, our researcher, would reach out to the patients who have volunteered to participate in the study. And the study team has already worked out ahead of time, how the researcher would know to contact patients and how patients would give permission to be contacted for this. And then Bob would work with the site to make sure that the patient completes the SPFQ at the 3 different time points, the start, the middle, and at the end somehow. And again, this is each company's decision about how they might do it. But in this example, Bob maybe comes to site visits. They've arranged that ahead of time. And then the researcher who's collecting the SPFQ information is going to, collect it, probably, blind it back to the studies and, work with the sponsors in the site to feed information back to them so that everyone has an idea of what the patient experience is like. Is there something about, participating that is a burden that maybe they can identify early? Or even if a site is doing a really great job in making patients feel comfortable. We also had feedback from one early adopter sponsor that they had feedback from this tool that the patients really appreciated the respect they were treated from the site. And when they shared that information back to the site, it gave everybody a good feeling about it. So next slide, please. So I think Lonnie had touched on the overall potential benefits for using the tools, and this is just a little more detail here on potential benefits for the SPFQ. So, again, once, a study team would have to start, using the tools, but the things that we heard that this could hopefully do down the, eventually, is that by regularly using, an SPFQ to assess patient burden and satisfaction with the experience, that we can take the potential value and actually map it to some key performance indicators. Because then you could understand the value of getting that patient engagement early and making your trials less of a burden and more patient-centric. So the benefit, some of the benefits that we've heard here that could possibly come from this are using the SPFQ and the feedback to identify barriers to enrolling or even staying active in a clinical study. And you could use that in real time, or if you're going to modify a future study, learn from the SPFQ, and using the SPFQ data to identify the barriers can actually translate to metrics such as looking at enrollment rates, the actual versus planned from your feasibility, or the percentage of visits completed or procedure completed. It also has the ability, and this is another thing that's very unique about it, by collecting patient experience feedback in real time while they're part of the trial, it can uncover, burdens and pain points for them that are not about the disease or the study itself, but other things that maybe can be addressed that, would affect adherence rate and compliance and having patients feel more comfortable actually staying in the study, retention rate. And of course, whenever we improve, patient satisfaction with taking part in a clinical study, we can contribute that to each company could collect their own SPFQ survey data, across their studies and over time for their clinical trial programs, and get a sense of, what a good patient-centric low burden study looks like. So next slide, please. And just one quote, we were very excited to hear about this. And since member company feedback is blinded to all this, I have no idea who this is. But the important thing is one of our member companies, one of their company objectives for the year was to, put an organizational priority around increasing, patient satisfaction and making, patient experience in clinical trial programs better. And their senior management at a very high level took a vote on various options they explored, and everyone thought that the SPFQ was the exact right tool to, help support and implement their corporate goal. So that was a wonderful thing to hear. And next slide, please. All right. And I'm going to show you, we're just going to show you some screenshots right now so you know what to expect if you go onto the TransCelerate website. And I believe you probably have gotten that information as part of signing up for the webinar or whatever. But when you first sign in to the SPFQ Toolkit main page, it will look like this. And if you click on that button in the upper right corner, the orange that says View the Patient Protocol Engagement Toolkit, it will take you to, next screen, please. Great. It'll take you to the next screen, which allows you to look at specific parts of the toolkit. So for example, if you want to look at the socialization presentation, we talked about that a little bit before, about, taking it to your organization and, go and presenting to management and other stakeholders to help make the decision and get them familiar with it. The SPFQ in your organization, if you click here, you'll be able to download that presentation ready for you to use. Next slide, please. And if you click on the SPFQ implementation button, you can download the implementation user guide. And we talked a little bit about an example of that earlier, and you can look at the whole thing there. And then the next slide is the actual SPFQ itself. So when you click on that, you then have a choice between looking at all three separate questionnaires. The first is the beginning of the study, and then of course the during study and the end of study. And it's three separate buttons to prevent, download and speed overload. So you can do it one at a time. And you won't be impacted by, technical connections in your location. Okay, and I think if you go to the next slide, thank you. So people always want to know what does the SPFQ questionnaire actually look like, and it's not very practical to show the whole thing on a screen. It gets very small. So this is just a subsection here to give you a chance to see what it looks like. So this is from during the study. In this case, the sponsor has decided that midpoint in the study, they're going to administer it. And I think they're actually up to 7 questions. And all of the questions and response options take this same format. So it makes it easy to analyze and score. And then as you can see here, it basically ask patients to rate, their experience based on organize and time convenience and being treated with respect. And then this is where, if for each individual study team or even each research team who wants to use the trial, you can change the heading there, your experience during the trial, and there it says to be completed during trial progress, and you could change that to make sense for whatever your given culture or where you choose to use it in the study is. Okay, and then next slide. Here we go. And so now we'll just talk a little bit about more implementation considerations. So these are also things that are addressed in the user guide, but we wanted to take some time to talk about them today because they're pretty common. So even though the user guide lets you think about it from your own organization's perspective, these are things that we've heard very consistently. So again, we talked about some of these before. Start as early as possible. Ideally, back when you're still even working on writing a protocol, because the earlier teams have to think about this and plan, the more opportunity to do all the study startup activities before you have to go back and change things. So roles and responsibility. So it's very important, to early on decide, who's going to do what and who's going to be responsible for what. And even just not at the study level, but within your own organization, is there going to be maybe somewhere in management, in terms of governance, who will be decision makers if there's something, a decision at the organization level, not just study. Gaining leadership buy-in and support. That is probably one of the most important things. Without leadership buy-in and support in terms of getting resources or giving permission to teams to go ahead and use if they want or make decisions, it's not going to go very well. Determine the budgetary needs. And this is also why it's important to start very early, because often by the time study startup activities take place and you would be hiring vendors who might have to help with this, the budget has already been set. So you want to look at this, as early as possible, and also by going through all your different functions and resources. If you might need a third-party vendor to help do this, that's also something to think about, what that will cost and what that might take internally. And then, what's also very important is we've done our best in the user guide to point out, thinking about, what are some of the legal and regulatory things that you should, of course, think about that. But every organization has their own policies about who needs to approve anything new or different or what's going on in a trial. So it's very important to make sure that as early as possible, you think through who those people might be. So again, and then next slide, please. Actually, I believe this is the last slide. So just to recap what we call the critical success factors in terms of making clinical trials a better experience for patients overall. Of course, you want to have a patient engagement strategy. Most organizations think a lot about the studies and their development, but thinking about patients and how to get patients involved is relatively new in the last couple of years, and it's becoming a very important industry strategy as well. And again, developing a cross-functional team. Quite important to make sure that all the different people who are responsible for various actions in the clinical trial process and study process are, part of a cross-functional team or communication plan to implement the tools. And something that people sometimes forget is to look in your own organization, especially in very large companies. sometimes we don't always think or know who already within the company has, existing knowledge about the disease and patient insights, and maybe they've already done some work that can, help you with the PPIT or the SPFQ, but just really thinking about making it a better experience for patients. You use the information and the resources that you already have. And again, that goes to identifying the experts within your own organization who need to participate, and also establishing relationships with patient advocacy groups. Many companies do this, but every clinical study team doesn't always think to talk to, their own leaders about whether patient advocacy groups can help, that they can talk to them more at the study level. So think about whether or not that's something that's appropriate in your organization, because that really can make a difference. And then I think the next slide is starting to wrap it up. There we go. Oh, and a poll question. So we're hoping today, but we want your honest feedback about whether this brief overview presentation has helped you understand the SPFQ better. Well, fantastic. Thank you. I'm glad that this has been a helpful introduction. And then we have another poll question, which is, I know we gave you, if you want to go to the next slide, if you could do that, please. This was a lot of information about a lot of different parts of the toolkit. So we want to get a sense if, just from what you've heard today, if any particular part of the toolkit itself you need more information on. Great. Okay. Actually, that so the most common answer here, about half of you said that socializing the toolkit and internal buy-in is the thing that you would need more information on in order to successfully implement it. And that is what we found when we first started going through this about, well, how do we talk to people internally with it? So again, I'll encourage you when you have some time, if you go to the TransCelerate website and are able to download the socialization presentation, take a look through it. And if you have questions in general about parts of the socialization or thinking about, how to present it, we can't answer specific questions for specific sponsors about your programs, but we can give general information and pointers. So when you go to the website and download any part of it, if you have those general questions, there's also a contact us button there that you would be able to press, and we would have somebody get back to you and try and see if we can give you more general information about that. Right.
All right, thank you, Lonnie and Allison. We have time for some Q&A. So I know we had some questions come in the original registration. We'll start with, where has the SPFQ been implemented in which countries?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I can give a brief. So again, because we don't share detailed information, I only have a little bit of high-level information. But we've had some sponsors who've been early adopters and have tested it early. And I think that the countries that it's been used in represent, the US, of course, the UK. I want to say some Western European countries. I feel like I'm not being very helpful, Lonnie. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I think we've got information right now on 15 to 20 countries, and while we all categorize our regions slightly differently, almost all regions are represented in early adoption so far.
Yeah, when we did the globalization interviews, one of the things that we looked at was likely countries where there had been expressed interest. So.
Okay, great. The next question, how will the data be collected, aggregated, and utilized?
Okay, well, all right. So data aggregation, that's a three-part question. So the collection right now will be each sponsor, obviously, or each user will collect it in the format that's best for your own program. And there are considerations there in the user guide for you. And then in terms of aggregation, initially, we need users. So as sponsors or other researchers start collecting SPFQ data, we would expect that to be aggregated in your own organization first, of course. And then, the analysis, obviously, you would analyze your own data. At some point, we would need a certain amount of data from enough users to make it, blinded and aggregated that, any data sharing would, you wouldn't be able to tell which sponsor or which program it would be to protect privacy.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Can or will anyone at TransCelerate advise us on how to implement the SPFQ?
Well, that goes back to, I think what I mentioned before that, related to the socialization deck, which is that we definitely welcome all general questions through that contact us /help button on the website, but we wouldn't be able to advise or ask questions about your specific study information. Such as, we wouldn't ask or talk about your population, your indication, your drug, or anything like that.
We have time for about 2 more questions. What responses have you heard from ethics committees so far?
Okay, Lonnie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. We've not gotten any feedback from any of the early adopters or any of the pilot efforts that were conducted late last year, the beginning of this year. There haven't been any ethics concerns reported. There have been, and I don't know the specific languages, but I understand there have been some requests from ethics committees to make adjustments in some of the words, particularly some of the instruction words from specific committees. But of course, every study team is going to address those as they need to, and that is all entirely independent. But there hasn't been any, any large pushback from ethics committees.
Okay, great. And the last question: have any health authorities commented on the SPFQ?
Yeah, and that answer is somewhat similar too. The FDA is the only health authority that we have seen review the SPFQ so far. They actually reviewed both the SPFQ and the PPET, and then SPFQ was also presented at the Global DIA meeting in San Diego this last summer, and a member of the FDA participated in that workshop, and there haven't been any concerns that this would impact the clinical trial itself. They have been nothing but supportive and enthusiastic for anything that's supporting patient experience and improving the patient experience. hopefully more to come with our continued engagement with other health authorities.
Okay, and we actually just had one more question come in. That is for all different types of clinical trials, such as drug trials or device trials. Are there different questionnaires, or is there one questionnaire for all clinical trials?
There are not different versions of the questionnaires for different populations. That one of the reasons that we tried to get a very broad array of the indications and the patients with the diseases when we did those one-on-one interviews was so that it could be generalizable. I'm not sure I mentioned before that most of the questions we tried to look at populations that are very common diseases around the world, and there's large patient populations, as well as on oncology in addition to chronic diseases. And the questionnaire was developed with patients who were over 18. So right now there aren't versions for adolescents, and we talked about devices. It could be used for devices, but again, depending on your own study, if there's something particularly unique or challenging about it, you might want to take a look and see if you maybe want to add another question that would help you understand better.
All right,
So we
great.
tried to make
Thank
it very
you both. Thank you both, Lonnie and Allison. With that, we'll go to one more final polling question. So if you could please provide how much value you found in this webinar. Okay, and thank you for your answers on that. We're happy to hear about 85% of you found moderate to a lot of value. So we appreciate you joining tonight. Thank you again to Lonnie and Allison, our speakers. As a reminder, you can view and download both the PPET and SPFQ Toolkits at the TransCelerate biopharmainc.com website under Patient Experience. The recording will be made available to you in the next few days. And again, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.